Hello, I'm Gina Myers, and this is Ready Garden Grow, an introduction to vegetable gardening with a class on growing vegetables in containers. The Master Gardener volunteers work with NC State Extension to provide gardeners with unbiased research-based information for your gardens and lawns and landscapes. We hope that you will follow the Master Gardener volunteers on their Facebook page for all kinds of local gardening news. And if you do have questions of the Master Gardeners, please contact them at 919-250-1084 or email them at mgardner@wakegov.com. This is the last module of a series of classes, 8 classes on growing vegetables. This will be growing vegetables in containers. So in this class, we will talk about the benefits of growing vegetables in containers, what kinds of containers are best for you to use, how do you care for those vegetables in the containers, and what vegetables are most suited for growing in containers. Obviously, one of the biggest benefits is that there's very little weeding. Out in our gardens, we can spend a lot of time pulling weeds, but in containers, you have potting mix, which is weed-free, and so you may just have 1 or 2 weeds throughout the season. They look pretty. You can mix them with flowers. They're great for patios and decks. You can even move them around if you have inadequate sunlight. So you may have one spot that's good in the morning and another spot good in the afternoon. So they do give you those advantages. And vegetables grown in containers have many of the same basic needs as those in beds. And we are going to talk about some of the things that are different, but whether they're in containers or in the garden bed, garden soil, they need at least 5+ hours of garden sun per day. And really we say 6 to 8 or even 8 to 12. Vegetables just really have to have a lot of sunlight. With containers, you're going to have an available water supply and probably be involved in watering them every day. They have to have well-drained soil, so they have to have holes in the bottom of the pot, so you simply cannot grow an outdoor vegetable in a container without holes in the bottom. They must have drainage. And they're going to require regular fertilization or time-release fertilization, depending on how you handle that. We'll cover that in a minute. And essentially, they're going to have the same spacing as they would in an intensive garden planting. So you're going to have to consider how much soil and how much space each plant will need in a container. You have all kinds of choices of containers. I have seen people grow plants in boots and in all kinds of funny bags and whatever you have that will hold soil and will also drain. The most commonly used containers are, unglazed terracotta pots or semi-porous wood pressed fiber pots. You'll see those more often now. And then also the non-porous types of containers, which would be plastic or metal, fiberglass, glazed. Glazed ceramic will be not very porous. So the difference in these is that the porous are going to allow a lot more water to evaporate. And so you're going to have to be a lot more aware of the water management if you're going to use terracotta. So a couple other things to think about choosing your containers are that the unglazed, just the terracotta, which I think are just beautiful pots, they can crack in freezing temperatures. It doesn't happen a lot. I've had some outside for many years, but it can happen more often with them than in a glazed ceramic. You might see differentiation in a metal pot. Say if you buy one of those metal tubs and drill holes in it. I have one of my invasive mints growing in one of those. They can get really hot, very hot in the daytime. So you wouldn't want to put a sensitive plant in there that would be really hurt if temperatures got extreme. Cedar and redwood are a lot more rot resistant than some of the other woods, so they can be very effective. And plastic containers are lightweight and not porous, so you may have to water them a little less, but they can fade with sunlight and they can get brittle and break over time. Porous containers will dry out faster, as we mentioned, and the darker colors will absorb heat more than the lighter ones. And so we're looking to not have these plants stressed out in containers. So the metal, I think, is more of an issue than just a dark color, but you can consider this. If you have kind of a fragile plant, you may not want to, like a lettuce, you may not want to put it in a dark pot. And then also where you put them can make a big difference. If you have them situated somewhere cool, like on the lawn or on a wood deck with afternoon shade, or a little bit cooler that way, versus out in full sun on cement. The one on cement will get a whole lot hotter and will dry out faster. So you'll just have to be more aware of what state it's in. So the container size is really a big factor here. And the common sense part of it tells you if it grows to be a big plant, it's going to need a big container. Because generally, to support all that foliage and the roots that will spread out and fill up that pot, you're going to need more soil in a bigger pot. So you can see here that cucumbers, for instance, will do just fine in a 1-gallon pot, even though that has a fair amount of foliage that will grow up as you stake it or twine it on some, put it on some twine up your porch railing or something. The roots are not that huge on cucumber plants as compared to, say, a tomato plant, which is one of the bigger ones that we grow. So one tomato plant would like a 5-gallon pot, especially if it's an indeterminate and rather than a bush, and will tend to get fairly large. I also think about like squash plants, the way they grow. They're very wide and spread out horizontally. So for me, it would make most sense to have a more horizontal pot than one that is straight up and down like a 5-gallon bucket or something like that. So just try to find the pot that would fit your plant the best. For instance, a lettuce plant or 3 or 4 lettuce plants might do better in a broader, more shallower pot because their roots are not terribly deep. So they just need a little bit of room to group together, not a ton of root space. But something that grows over a long period of time through the heat of the summer, like tomatoes and peppers and eggplants, squash, they would all like plenty of soil and plenty of root space. The other really critical piece for containers, and I can't stress this enough, you must use potting mix. You cannot go out to your garden, no matter how beautiful your compost is, and dig it up and put it in a pot. You have to remember that when you disturb that soil and you put it into a container, all the structure, the wormhole structures, the air hole structures have all been disturbed. And that heavy soil, which has clay or sand in it, is going to really prevent good air circulation throughout that pot. So that's one of the primary reasons why we purchased potting mix and use that. It's made out of lighter weight materials, peat or coir, or has vermiculite in it or perlite. So it's much, much lighter. The plant roots will not drown in there because if they don't have adequate oxygen, they will drown essentially. So you're going to use a potting mix. Generally, you do not need water retention granules, and you should always look on the bags to see if they specifically designate that this mix is appropriate for vegetables, because some of the moisture control media or some of the water retention granules in particular are not designed to be used in edible gardens. They're made out of a polyacrylamide material and should not be used in vegetable gardening. Some of the moisture control media is okay to use. That may just simply be some kind of a pre-wetted organic material that's okay, but just make very good sure on the potting mix that you purchase that it is labeled for vegetable gardening. You can make your own mixes. I wouldn't advise this as you're just getting started. I would definitely get some experience with potting mix. If you do want to mix your own, there are some recipes for doing that online. These might include peat moss, perlite, compost. You can put your own compost in it, but you wouldn't put that much. Permatil. There are a number of materials that you can put in there in some kind of a mix to give a real nice lightweight consistency to it. You're going to also have to probably add some lime and some controlled release fertilizer. So it's more complicated. You have to know a little bit more about what you're doing in terms of trying to get the pH and fertility correct. In containers, when you think about it, you're watering from the top and everything is moving straight down. In the soil, you're watering, but the movement of the water may go laterally. So we know that when we water pots, the water goes straight through, and oftentimes you're leaching out some of the fertility. So you do want to make sure that you're paying attention to your plants, noticing if those lower level leaves are turning a little yellow, or if you're just not getting any growth, you may need to add some more fertilizer. And one of the benefits of purchasing the potting mix is that they've already got the amendments added, and usually a pretty good pH. So they'll say on there whether there's enough food in there for 3 or 6 months, something like that. But for a long season crop like tomatoes, you need to keep an eye on it because you probably will need to add some during the season. There are different types of fertilizers. You can buy just a liquid chemical fertilizer, which has nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in it. It's very soluble, just like the Miracle Grow you buy and mix up, it's blue. And that's pretty quick. You can also buy the pellets that are controlled release, and that's what a lot of the nurseries do. And what is usually in the potting mixes that you purchase. So you can also just buy a separate container of that and sprinkle a little bit of that in according to the label. And the granular fertilizers you can use, you just have to be very careful not to overdo it because in that pot where conditions are frequently dry and wet, if your plant happens to be out on a hot day and gets extra dry and there is fertilizer in there, that can actually burn the roots and you will see the damage right away. So just want to be very careful with fertilizer, use it as needed, but don't overdo it. Watering, there are different ways you can water. Of course, watering can, most of us have one of those. You can collect it from the rain barrel. But it's if you have multiple pots, that may not be adequate for you. It's really nice if your garden hose just reaches all your pots. That's the easiest way to do it. But of course, be very careful on a hot day that water sitting in there hasn't gotten super hot. So I always run it for 30 seconds or so before I turn it on to my pots. Drip irrigation is really nice. If you have it, it's very efficient because it just releases a little bit of water at a time. You can set it up so there are these little drip plugs that you put into each pot, and then there's a line that runs across them. You can set it up so that there's a timer on it. And even if you go on vacation, you can make sure that your plants are watered every day, which they will require in the middle of summer. Or you can set them up with bags or containers that hold water, kind of the self-watering types, or the actual containers themselves, the plant containers that have a liner in the bottom that you fill up with water. And those are very handy. I have one of those, and it will definitely carry plants through some hot periods. But they are more expensive. So if you're doing a number of them, that may be not feasible, financially, but they are very nice for use in the garden. And yeah, I like mine a lot. So what kinds of plants will you use in containers, or will grow well in containers? And generally we would say the smaller types, the dwarf or the bush varieties. It's really hard to stake plants when they're in a container because it's hard to get a big enough structure in there or a deep enough pole to really support them without attaching it to something else. If you have a porch pole or something like that you can rig it up, that would work. But that's sort of a limiting factor in that way. And also you can just plant whatever is in season. That's what's handy. You can clean one out and put another one in. I often use the same potting soil. I may freshen it up a little bit each season, but usually you can get at least a couple of years out of a big pot of potting soil. It will stay good. You'll just have to make sure you refresh the fertilizer and maybe top it off with a little bit of new potting mix. I particularly love putting things like carrots in containers because in my garden I have nematodes in certain areas, and it tends to be pretty clay, so the carrots just don't grow well, but they grow really well in a container with that nice light material. I also I grow all kinds of things in containers, so I don't really think there's much of a limitation, but we'll talk about the size limitation in a minute. I absolutely love putting herbs in containers. I have an herb container on my back porch and an herb container on my front porch. I trade them out sometimes seasonally. For instance, basil is only there in the summer and cilantro is only there in the cool seasons. But some of them are perennial, so you can fill a pot or two with perennial herbs and add a few seasonal flowers. And then, also have just some annual herbs that you put in those. It's just wonderful to be cooking dinner and go out and pick a little parsley or basil and go on with your cooking. So the vegetables that really would be difficult to grow in containers are the very big ones. Cantaloupe, watermelon, those vines get so huge, they'll take over half your garden. So you're better off trying to find a place out in the garden to let them sprawl. Asparagus would grow in a container, but asparagus is a perennial vegetable, so you're just going to be better off having it out in the ground where it can overwinter in the ground with a little more protection. Corn is just awkward because it's so vertical and big. It would be very difficult to grow more than a couple ears of corn in a container. And it's mentioned here that tomatoes aren't particularly good in containers, but I think they do fine. You're just going to have to stake them. An indeterminate tomato plant will continue growing throughout the season and will require significant staking. So we have covered in this class on growing vegetables in containers, some of the benefits of doing it, how you can select appropriate containers for your vegetables, how to take care of the vegetables, and which vegetables are most suited for containers. The topic of container gardening is not really covered in our Ready Garden Grow handbook. So you can go to a publication from NC State that's called How to Create a Container Garden for Edibles in the North Carolina Piedmont. And it's an excellent publication that fills in all the details that you may not have gotten here. This is the last of the series of 8 classes from planning your garden to growing vegetables in containers. We hope that it's been of benefit to you, and if you have any further questions, please contact the Master Gardeners at 919-250-1084 or email mgardner@wakegov.com. For additional information, we really encourage you to take advantage of the Ready Garden Grow Handbook, which is on our Wake County website. So if you just Google wake.ces.ncsu Ready Garden Grow Handbook, you should get that, or you can type in this address. Also, an absolutely wonderful resource is our comprehensive gardening text, the Extension Gardener Handbook. And this is what we use for training Master Gardeners. And it's available online or for purchase in hard copy. So just Google Extension Gardener Handbook, North Carolina. And with that, I thank you for watching, and we will see you in the garden.